My name's John Britton. I was Concorde Chief Engineer from 1994 till 2003 when the aircraft went out of service. Today I'm stood in front of Alpha Fox, which was the 16th production aircraft and the final one to be built here at Filton. But just going back in history, there were 2 prototype aircraft, 2 pre-production aircraft and 16 production aircraft. And this was a joint project with the French. This aircraft was built, it was finished in 1979. It went into service then, and it's actually flown 5,639 flights. The aircraft was cleared. In fact, the design life was 6,700. So we did, in the mid to late 90s, we did a life extension program. So this aircraft could actually have flown 8,500 supersonic flights. And as I say, it's only flown 5,600. British Airways would actually have liked us to extend the life to 10,000 supersonic flights, which it was quite capable of. This aircraft, as I say, was the last production aircraft. It flew into here. The last flight was on the 26th of November, 2003. So this was the last production aircraft to be built here. It was the last production aircraft to do a flight anywhere. It flew from Heathrow, flight around the houses, over Bristol, and landed here. So it was the last supersonic flight of any civil passenger Concorde. So this aircraft is actually very special to us. And in fact, you might see in a minute, if we have a picture inside, the seats were fitted, they were upgraded by British Airways, designed by Sir Terence Conran. So this one has got lovely leather seats in there. And it's the only aircraft on display at any of the museums that's actually got the engines installed. So this one is virtually exactly as it arrived here in November 2003. I started my apprenticeship here at the Bristol Airplane Company in 1963, and I had a 5-year apprenticeship, which was actually brilliant. And towards the end of my apprenticeship, I went into the design office. So I was actually designing Concorde parts when I was in my late teens and early 20s. I was lucky enough to be here. I was in the design office when the prototype, the French prototype actually took off in March 1969, and our prototype, 002, took off from here at Filton on the 9th of April 1969. And we were in the design office over on the other side of the runway, and we were all invited or allowed to go out and stand by the side of the runway to see Concorde taking off. And I'm actually standing at the back here, looking at it, and with some of my colleagues. I was on the power plant group, and we were all invited to go out there, and then the crew went on board, and the aircraft taxied out, and we all stood on the side of the runway, but we weren't sure that the aircraft was actually going to take off because it had done lots of high-speed taxis beforehand, and each time it got up to about 100 knots, and one of the primary navigation instruments had failed. So Trubby wouldn't take it off with a failed instrument. But then on this particular day, he said, if I get up to 100 knots and the instrument doesn't fail, he said, I will go. So we were all stood on the side of the runway with bated breath, waiting to see if it would actually go. And that day, 9th of April, 1969, it went roaring down the runway, and off it went, took off, and everyone cheered, and it was great jubilation. And you can imagine, I was a 22-year-old engineer then, the excitement of seeing a supersonic aircraft that I'd worked on the design here taken to the skies. And it flew straight to Fairford, which then became the flight test centre. Now, as I say, there were two prototypes, a French and English one. After quite a bit of flight testing, they discovered that there was further development needed in the body shape. Power plant needed developing, and there were lots of things to do. So the pre-production aircraft were incorporated all those changes, and then so there was a French and a British pre-production aircraft, and those changes were incorporated. Then after more flight testing, there were additional features embodied in to get the final production version, which resulted in the 16 production aircraft. Now, originally, there were a lot more production aircraft planned, and there were orders from around the world, but the trouble is there was a lot of environmental pressure and resistance particularly from America at the time, because don't forget, they were trying to develop their supersonic aircraft, and the English and the French spent about 1,000 million each, which was funded by the British and the French taxpayer, on developing Concorde. The Americans actually spent the same amount of money, but they never even got a prototype in the air. The thing that made Concorde unique and made it special and made it work was the power plant, and particularly the air intake control system, which allowed Concorde to achieve those Mach 2 speeds without the engines misbehaving. A jet engine won't normally fly above supersonic speeds. So the air intake was a really important part of the design, and what that did was actually slowed the air down from Mach 2 to a Mach 0.5, about 500 miles an hour. So the aircraft was able to cruise at Mach 2 for 2 hours, 2.5 hours, with no problem. And so the flight to New York, which was 3 hours, 20 minutes, don't forget, subsonic aircraft can only do it in about 8 hours, but Concorde could do it in 3 hours, 20 minutes. And that included about 2 hours, 2.5 hours supersonic. It flew at above all the subsonic aircraft so that it didn't interfere with them. So it flew at about 50,000 feet, whereas a subsonic aircraft flies at 35,000 feet. At that altitude, when you looked out the window, the thing that made Concorde flights absolutely special was when you looked out the window, you could see the curvature of the Earth. And you could also look up, I expect people have seen the pictures out of the window of a spacecraft where you've got that dark blue hue of the sky, and you've got exactly the same effect when you're flying in Concorde. So you've got that really dark blue, and that made the Concorde experience absolutely unique. And because Concorde did the trip so fast, you actually were flying faster than the rotation of the Earth. So it was about 3.5 hour flight. We were 5 hours, New York was 5 hours behind London, so you arrived about 1.5 hours to 2 hours before you'd taken off, which was quite a unique experience. You could have a nice meal on the aircraft and then arrive in New York and have a breakfast if you wanted to. I had a nice story that my wife likes to tell. We phoned the credit card company and they said, "Oh, I'm very sorry, sir, but your card is being cloned because someone has used it in London 3 or 4 hours ago, and now someone is trying to use it in New York." And I said, "Yeah, that's me." I said, "We've just flown over on Concorde." And they said, "Oh, terribly sorry, sir. We'll unblock your card straight away." So people remember that in July 2000, there was one of the Air France Concordes crashed. At the time, I was on holiday in Cornwall with my family, and we heard it on the news. So I said, "I've got to go." I jumped in the car and drove back to Filton, and our managing director had laid on an aircraft. I took 2 or 3 of my team and some Rolls-Royce chaps, and we went over to to Paris. We were on the crash site the next day. So you get absolutely embroiled in the whole Concorde story. We did the investigation. We found what had caused the accident, which was actually a sharp piece of metal that had fallen off the aircraft, which took off previously before Concorde. The aircraft ran over it and it cut right through the tread of the tire, which exploded, and a big piece of it went up and hit the wing. And because the fuel tanks were absolutely full, it pressurized the tank and blew out a chunk of the bottom skin, and that caused a leak of 60,000 litres per second, which unfortunately ignited and caused the aircraft fire. The three-line attack to break the chain was new tyres, fit some liners in the bottom of the fuel tank so that if there was any failure, again, any leakage would be restricted, and to protect the electrics that we think had caused the spark to ignite the fuel. And that meant that we could get the aircraft back in service. The airworthiness authorities accepted that. Those modifications were incorporated in the aircraft, and the aircraft went back into service, and it flew for another 2 years in service. But the day that it was due to go back into service, this aircraft off of Fox was on a test flight going to New York, and the terrorists flew those aircraft into the Twin Towers. A third of British Airways Concorde frequent flyers, these are the people that had the money. It was £3,000 to £4,000 to fly each way on Concorde. They had the money to do that. So when the terrorists flew into those Twin Towers, they killed a third of British Airways frequent flyers. When that happened, the American public, they just stopped flying. Not only Concorde, but they stopped flying the Atlantic altogether. So any airlines that were operating aircraft across the Atlantic, their trade just virtually disappeared overnight. Having lost all that revenue from their Concorde operation, British Airways and the costs, the maintenance costs were increasing as well. British Airways accountants, together with the Air France people, they took the decision that unfortunately they would stop their Concorde operations. My one regret is that I never got my 2 children to fly on Concorde. So it's a big family. You know, it affects everyone that has worked on Concorde. And my old boss, Ted Talbot, who was the Concorde chief power plant engineer, said the 3 things to describe Concorde for him was the speed, the power, and the beauty. And he said the greatest of these was beauty. And if you look at the aircraft there now, it still looks as modern as any other aircraft which is brand new now. During the Concorde operations, every year British Airways did a round the world Concorde flight. So you could buy a Concorde trip around the world. It obviously couldn't fly around the world non-stop, so it would stop at various locations around the world, places like Singapore, or they varied the places depending on which year. They didn't do the same places every year. But I think probably the most iconic one, and the ones that actually Joan Collins loved, was Barbados. She had a home in Barbados, and every winter she would fly Concorde to Barbados, have a nice long holiday in the sun, away from the British winter, and she would use the aircraft so that was just about at the extent of its range. It was getting on for 4,000 miles to Barbados, and that was just about as far as Concorde could fly. But I think that was quite sort of romantic and one of the nicest places for it to be operated from. When we did the development of the aircraft, you have to explore the whole of the flight envelope. That means different speeds, different altitudes, different angles of attack, etc. and we cleared the aircraft to over Mach 2.2. Now, you've always got, when you're operating the aircraft in service, you've always got to have a margin from the cleared envelope to the actual in-service operation. So generally, in service, the aircraft only flew at Mach 2 or 2.02 sometimes. But occasionally, depending on the atmospheric conditions, if you had a tailwind, you could actually get across the Atlantic very quickly. And so, although the block-to-block scheduled time was 3 hours 20 minutes, one flight actually did it in just under 3 hours. So that was pretty quick, but the nominal speed is 1,350, which is Mach 2. As Concorde speeds up, initially it flies and takes off subsonically, flies out over, say from London, flies across west until it gets to Hartland Point. And at that point, there was an accel point. So they would switch the reheats on, and the aircraft would then climb and accelerate. Now, when it got to Mach 1, because of the design of the wing, it's a supersonic wing, so it performs best. It was fine-tuned to be economic at supersonic speeds, so it doesn't operate quite so well at subsonic speeds. And in fact, the center of lift and the center of pressure on the wing moves when it goes supersonic. So there's an automatic system on here to keep what we call the center of gravity in the right place. So the center of gravity is the weight of the aircraft over the lift point. So when the lift point moves on the wing, it's a bit technical, I'm afraid. So when the aircraft goes supersonic, the center of lift moves on the wing. So the way to keep the center of gravity in the right place is to move the fuel. And that was done, there was a computer that controlled that, and it pumped the fuel when it was accelerating or decelerating. It would pump the fuel forward or pump the fuel back, depending on whether it was starting to cruise or at the end of cruise. This aircraft here could actually have continued till about 2015 with the life extension program. But if we'd gone to 10,000 supersonic flights, there would have to have been quite a lot of work done on the fuselage, especially the area on the top of the fuselage going towards the fin at the back, which we call the crown skins, because those were the most structurally sensitive areas that would have needed attention. When we did the life extension from 6,700 to 8,500, we were able to do it by just adjusting the inspection frequencies, and the authorities accepted that. But they said if we went from 8,500 to 10,000, they wouldn't want to increase the inspections to manage those structurally sensitive areas. They would want the crown skins replaced. Now, if the operators had to take those crown skins off at the back, we would have to manufacture new crown skins from the top central line of the fuselage round to about stringer 13, and they would have had to have been new skins made, riveted on. To do that, you'd have had to strip all the interior, the furnishings, everything out of the aircraft, and that would have been a very expensive job. That's why when Virgin said, oh, we'll take the aircraft on and carry on flying it, I don't think they quite knew what would be involved with the cost of doing that exercise. So whilst this one could have carried on, some of the other British Airways aircraft that had higher lifetimes on them might have had to been withdrawn. So the fleet could have got smaller, but certainly this one could have gone on for another 3,000 flights. Well, here we are, sat on the Concorde in a cabin. I'm in seat 2. The seat just there on the left was the favourite of Joan Collins and Princess Diana. They both liked it there because the stewardesses were close by, and they got good service. For those people that had a supersonic flight when the aircraft were in service, they had a presentation pack, and this contained Concorde menu, which had caviar, marinated scallops, fillet steak. You had all the best wines. There was a whole wine list. You could have the best champagne, Moet champagne. You had some Concorde stationery, which you could impress all your friends that you've been on Concorde. In addition to the Concorde menus and the wine lists, etc., everyone that flew on Concorde had a present from British Airways, and this was my present when I took my wife for a trip in 2001. This is the present I got, which is a silver paperweight, and it's engraved with, it says British Airways Concorde on there. You can actually get now a Concorde medal, which is great for remembering all the Concorde operations and what a unique aircraft it was. And this has got a little card in it signed by Jock Lowe, who's one of the Concorde captains. It's a nice memento of all those years and that Concorde special technical achievement that allowed you to fly to New York in 3 hours 20 minutes. And my son says to me, how am I going to tell my children that their grandfather could fly to New York from London in 3 hours 20 minutes, and yet if we want to go now, it takes us 8 hours to fly subsonic? And I said, well, there's only one answer to that: Concorde.